So this will be our first notes in oceanography, and this is going to be on ocean exploration, and we're going to start with something called the Age of Exploration. There was four main groups that were really pivotal in this. They weren't the only ones, but they were the Chinese, the Vikings, the Europeans. Actually three, I don't know why I said four. There's three. And within the Europeans you have the Spanish, the Portuguese, lots of other ones, but the English, lots of them were spreading out, and lots of different reasons though. The Chinese, their reasons when we compare them to the Vikings and the Europeans, not that really the same, maybe somewhat, but not really. But if we look at the goals of the Chinese, first one was Buddhism. They wanted to spread Buddhism. They had trained people. They put them on ships. They sent them to, they would send these ships out. They would meet new people, and they would share their religion and try to lead people to become Buddhists. It's one of their original goals of spreading out. And also was immigration. So they wanted to spread their culture as well. So if we put that in here. So they would take large groups of villages or people from a village, and they would put them on a boat, and they would send them to different places. And there were large groups. They would send people as far as Australia, Indonesia. I'll fix that in a minute. And Malta. Lots of different places. And so immigration, so they were sending Chinese people out to all these different places, and if you go there today, they're still there. And even not just through naval means or through the ocean, but many people believe that the Chinese traveled up through Asia, crossed the Bering Land Bridge, and formed, or people that are now Alaska Native came from those people that originally came from China, from those areas. And so immigration. And one of these last ones, there's some other ones, but we're going to add immortality. The Chinese believed there was certain minerals or substances where if people took them, they could live forever. And really they were searching for that as they went on in these ships. And they spread their people, they tried to spread their religion, but in all that, they didn't really mix their culture with the other cultures. Eventually, they withdrew, and they stopped exploring the ocean. But what's really an important contribution is the compass. So they were the first culture to come up with, north, south, west, and east, something you could put on a ship and know which direction you were going, and they developed it. And it was then used by other groups, but they are really the first group to do that. So they had a lot of technology going in their time, but eventually they withdrew and didn't explore as much as they had. Another important group are the Vikings, and Eric the Red is one of those famous Vikings, and they are known as, very barbaric. So if you've ever seen movies, they portray them as just, bloodthirsty, and so on. But that's not necessarily true. Some of it is colored to make the other cultures get more sympathy, I guess. And many of the stories you hear, they have they're called sagas, I think. They were written much later, after these travels of the Vikings took place. But the Vikings really were good shipbuilders, and they built something called longboats, and they were really easy to maneuver and could travel great distances. And if we look at some of these, see if I can find these here. Here's some of their exploration routes. This says, 700 and 941, but you can see they left Norway, Sweden, the Scandinavia up here. They went out into the, Central Europe, Russia. They really went into, their next countries over were, Ireland, England, Paris, France and Germany, and all these kind of, it was Frankish Empire. It's not Germany yet, but eventually it would be. Hungary was there, and so on, and maybe not necessarily England was there, but many of these countries are Spain down here, Portugal, all down here is Italy, right? But many of these countries, the Vikings made their way into. They would conquer them and take their spoils and also form colonies as well. But you can see that they not only went south, and as they were going west to Ireland and Scotland and these places, they also traveled to Iceland, then to Greenland, and then to Newfoundland, and then to Canada. And there's proof today that they were there. So they were great mariners or sailors. They really had refined this process of sailing out on the ocean. So great sailors. Spell that right. And they get a lot of bad press for their being barbarians, but it's probably not as bad as many portray it if you read books on it. And so the next group that kind of really took control here are the Europeans. As their culture developed and certain things happened to the culture, the Europeans came along and developed this great ability to travel by the ocean as well. And their goal, really the goal of the Vikings, was to conquer and acquire wealth and territory. The Europeans were really no different. They wanted to expand. But were really driven by wealth, probably more than anybody. And they were worried about something called the spice trade. During this time of age of exploration, there was, something called the spice trade, or the Silk Road, where countries like India and China had these resources such as, cinnamon and different types of spices, incense. They had these drugs that could only get there, opium, and the Europeans wanted it, but they had to pay dearly for it. They just didn't give it to them. They made them pay a lot of money for it. Plus, it was really difficult to get. It wasn't close, and if we look at this right here, this spice trade, we'll see if we can go there. Maybe we can't. Let's go back. Let's go here. Maybe right here. Okay, so you can kind of see this. Here's Europe, and they would have to go all the way through like Middle East, across here, India, down here. This is overland, the Silk Road, so they'd have to go by, whatever camel, whatever they're taking, horses, and so on, and they'd have to go all this way from Europe all the way to China and then back. Okay, or they could go through the naval route, through Mediterranean Ocean, down through the Red Sea, and out into the Indian Ocean, and then this would be India, and then they'd have to go through, around India, and then they could go, around through Java and these places and make it to China. But it's a long, long route, okay? Lots of obstacles, okay? And cost them dearly to get these things, these spices and such, from here to get there and get them back. And as navigation became easier, they thought, why don't we just not go over land, but go by boat? So then what they did is, if we look at some of these maps here, let's see if we can find a good one. Yeah, right here. So here's England, right? And the Europeans, instead of going all the way across these continents and all the mountains and you name it, they just would go down around Africa. Now, nobody had been around this, this little bottom part of Africa, South Africa, And but as the sailing ships got better, navigation got better, and understanding of what was there got better, then they were able to make it. And they had confidence that, boy, if we could just go this way, it's probably easier, more, it costs less for us to do it. We could still get the spices and such, but we'd have much more control over it. We wouldn't have to worry about people stealing and fighting us as we came back and stealing what we bought. And that was the idea of the Europeans. So the spice trade, less costly route to wealth. And when you think of this, the Europeans were much more advanced in, weaponry, I guess you could say, and they built these ships and so on. On the ocean, they had an advantage. So they decided to try to overcome this spice route problem or spice trade problem by sending ships to China instead. And that's really what Columbus was doing. Took 4 voyages, ended up not in China per se around the Horn of Africa, but instead ended up going the other way and trying to get around to China that way, or not get around, but get to China instead of going down around Africa and up through the Indian Ocean, go the other way. Didn't know what was there, kind of had an idea, but didn't know exactly what was there, and they would take voyages and see what was there. And when Columbus first landed in Central America, he thought he was in India, but he wasn't. He was in South America. They found lots of riches, though. They found gold and lots of other things they never even knew about or knew was there, and they would take that and conquer people. And Vespucci was one. Lots of these explorers were funded by kings and other people, and it was all about money, like making the spice trade easier, finding other routes of making money. And so that was really what was driving the Europeans, money. And through this, one of the important people of this time besides Columbus was somebody called Prince Henry the Navigator, and he was from Portugal. He wasn't a sailor at all, but he was somebody that financed these trips. And as he did so, he came up with this idea: is instead of just picking people randomly to go on these trips, they had a captain that knew what he was doing, but a lot of the people would go and they didn't know what they were doing. So he developed ways to improve that, and one was by making maps, and maps that were accurate, and teaching people how to be good sailors and how to use the stars and all these different methods to improve the process. And it says here Academy, he was one of the first people to start a school that taught people how to navigate the ocean. First one to do it. Okay, and then finally, look at this last one here, something called the Northwest Passage. So now as Columbus is going over to, if you go back to this map, so Columbus is leaving here, he's going this way, hoping he could land up. Let's go back. As he's going this way, don't know this is here, he's thinking he can just go this way, nothing in the way, he'd end up over here, right? But he hits this and realizes, well, you know what, unless there's a way through here, through Central America, I got to go all the way around South America. That's just as bad as going all the way around Africa. So, and you get down here in these lower latitudes, or these higher latitudes, weather's not as good, lots of different things. So they wanted to kind of stay in the middle here somehow. They couldn't find a way. And they came to think, well, maybe there's a way around North America, and that's called the Northwest Passage. So they would go over the top, find a cheaper way. Maybe instead of going all the way around, we could just go this way, because this is a much shorter distance between North America and Europe. If you compare this distance to going all the way around Africa. So maybe we can just go right over top of North America and then be over to China. And that's the Northwest Passage. They worked on that for years, and eventually they were successful, but the problem was the cold temperatures. And this was true not only in the Arctic, but in the Antarctic. And if you've seen Shackleton, that was another, all those people died. That wasn't uncommon. That was pretty common. People would go on these, ships through the Northwest Passage. They get frozen in the ice and couldn't get out. And a lot of people would die. They'd die from scurvy. They'd run out of food, and so on. Lots of harrowing stories. They'd have to wait for the ice to thaw. They could go inland, but if you're looking at this map here, they're stuck up here. There's not a lot of food up here, so they could get down into Hudson Bay here. Maybe that's a pretty long distance. So Northwest Passage, though. But today, what's really kind of cool about the Northwest Passage is maybe today will be a time we'll actually be able to use it. It would really help Alaska when you think about it, because how far, we get stuff from China and Japan and those places, but just think if countries, instead of having to go all the way around, South America or even through the Panama Canal, they could just go over the top of North America. And if our ports in northern Alaska weren't frozen in, they could still get some of these things that they need, like oil, gasoline, just food in general, because those ports freeze up. You can't get anything in. You either got to fly it in or not have it. And so today you might see, as the global climate changes, is this going to be a viable thing for a trade route? And really, in the end, once we move beyond the Chinese, this was all about trade. The Chinese were really involved in trade of their culture. But when you look at the Vikings, the Europeans, it became more about trade in commodities. And sure, their culture was traded at the same time. As people moved there, they shared their ideas. But it really became about making money, more so than what the Chinese were doing. And that's kind of the age of exploration. Introduction to it. We'll be doing some reading on it. We'll be learning about it, watching some videos and so on, and you should have a good idea of these different ages of ocean exploration. And that's the first one. Make sure you annotate these notes well and turn them in. You may want to share your notes as well with somebody else in the class and compare what each of you got. So there you go.